Thanks for hosting this at the last minute. Um, I titled this title because I feel like we all need optimism and we all need something to do. So I am going to go through here. Now I don't have. There we go. Who am I? We just gave a little introduction there. So I'm a consultant and I've worked on lots of things in BC, and that's what I'm still doing. So I'm here today just to do that. A number of years ago, and I'm going to fly through this. So just it's incredible that almost 300 people signed up for basically what is a Policy Geek webinar, and I will endeavor to not make it boring, but we are going to get into some of the details of that. And I'm going to start with a little bit of history and context, and then go through the framework and talk about what it is and what it isn't, and some thoughts on it. So, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. So a few years ago, colleagues Karen Price and Dave Doust and I wrote this report, BC's Old Growth Forest, the Last Stand for Biodiversity, and we published it as well. And we came to the astonishing and detailed confusion that not all old forest is created equal. And we said, there's lots of this out there, and there's not so much of this out there. And the provincial government has an industry have tended to pretend that they're the same thing. And we identified major policy gaps in how the forest managed to look at representation. And so, you know, we're still struggling to get these incredibly basic messages back into government and have them be reflected in the work and actions that take place. And so this current set of work, I think, is the next opportunity to do that. Of course, the management of forests is not the only ecological gap out there in terms of issues or management concerns. This is my short list of things. We don't have endangered species, effective endangered species. We don't have ecological community protection. We have protection for most species that have been limited by timber supply caps. We don't think about carbon in any management decision at all. We think about making money first, not whether it makes sense for communities or the ecosystem, i.e. the development of the major export business on pellets. Mining tends to be outside any rules we do have. Oil and gas development has tended to be outside of the rules that we do have. We have poor cumulative effects management, as was witnessed by the Blueberry court case decision, and we don't have any planning around resorts and how they mesh with all of the rest of it. So there's a whole bunch of things that we need to look at out there. Why am I here? I don't work for the provincial government. This is not my responsibility. I'm not advocating on government's behalf. I'm not doing any of those things. But after 30 years doing this work, I have some cautious optimism. So my interest is in sharing that because we all need cautious optimism. So just a little context. In 2020, these guys wrote this report. You're all super familiar with it, the Old Growth Strategic Review. They had a whole bunch of recommendations. Two of them, well, the first one was First Nations need to be centered. The two that I'm focusing on here are, they talked about deferring at-risk old forest, and they talked about a paradigm shift for forest management. And this work is stemming out of these recommendations. And you know, in terms of whether there's actually a need for optimism out there, what I've seen is that there has been a significant shift in language. You know, we have a premier talking about exhausted forests. That's a very unusual position to be in. But there's a lot of talk about industry shifting to higher value, lower volume endeavors. I have personally watched a shift, although there's lots of gaps still in terms of how the province is engaging with nations. So I see positivity there. In the global sense, back in '93, we had the Rio Earth Summit, and that from that stemmed the Convention on Biological Diversity. More recently, we've had the update of that. That has led to Canada, for instance, signing on to a framework that actually looks quite similar to this one that I'm going to talk about today. In the global stage, there is an increasing acknowledgement of the fact that a failure to manage for biodiversity and climate will be catastrophic. And there's some kind of twisted irony about the fact that an increasing acknowledgement of this dire state is a reason for optimism, but sadly that's where we're at. So I'm going to take what you can and run with the optimism. Just a few summary points in terms of old growth deferrals. It's hard to know whether to be positive or negative. They've happened. That's good. There's extremely variable implementation across the province. There's definitely poor transparency on how that's happened. There's been a tendency to still push those into the non-contributing land base so that they weren't really deferrals, because if you defer something that wasn't at risk, it's not a deferral. In some places like the Kootenays, there's actually been good, pretty good take up of the deferrals, and they're having an effect. So this has been, this is a piece of work that has had some positive and some less positive elements from its implementation. Without unduly impacting the timber supply of the province, this clause that effectively limited what we could do in British Columbia has now in fact been deleted, both in the general policy and in the GAR orders affecting wildlife. That second change happened just before Christmas. Quietly, this is a very positive thing. Of course, it doesn't actually do anything at all. So we needed it to happen. It's very important that it has happened, and it signals change and a desire to change, but it does nothing in itself. Now we need new forest and wildlife targets to reflect ecosystem health. So that is a positive thing. $10 million was set aside to try and promote alternative silviculture by stopping clear cutting. Nothing has happened yet on the ground. We need incentives to do it. There's lots and lots of talk, but nothing has happened on this. I believe BCTS were pushed towards this a couple of years ago, but we've not seen change there on the ground. There's conservation financing, and that's great. Nobody quite knows how that's going to play out and what it's going to finance and how that's going to work across the board. But money is, well, I rarely say money is good, but in this case, money is good. And now we get to the subject for today, which is the ecosystem health framework from the province. It was released in November, and it's open for public comment for another week. And now I'm going to go through it. It's only 14 pages long. So if you were hoping for a 200-page document, this is not your document. I think that's probably a good thing. It's high level. It's trying to set direction. And you should read it. It's interesting. It's available on the web if you just search it out. Just from a starting perspective, there's a message from the Minister, Minister Cullen, and it says the province's biodiversity and ecosystems are under threat. It says they're essential for health and well-being, and not only to themselves, but for ecosystems, economies, and communities. And that we need conservation and recovery of species at risk, and it will also set the path for co-development and implementation of new policies, legislation, and strategies. And, you know, I have to say that my answer to that is, wow, we haven't seen this kind of message out of government ever, from my perspective. And so this is a strong opening. So as I'm going to go through this, I'm going to talk about a section of the strategy and then make some suggested comments from my perspective. You know, this is a big deal. I think it requires some applause, some congratulations. It's been a little slow, but then turning the ship around is also always slow. Now, though, we need to make it real. So these are great words. Let's make them real. In terms of its intent, the British Columbia government commits to the conservation and management of ecosystem health and biodiversity as an overarching priority, and will formalize this priority through legislation and other enabling tools that apply to all sectors. Again, that is a very strong statement of intent, and I believe should be congratulated. This was committed to in the sense that the government signed on to the recommendations in the OGSR, but this is a more formal recommitment to this intent. Of course, making it real means it has to be overarching. So from a comment perspective, this is great. And it has to overarch all the other pieces of legislation out there. And I think a really critical question, and one that needs to be focused in on with laser sharp clarity, is how will government ensure that government and industry are held accountable to this strategy? Because that will be a key piece of implementation. And I'm going to go through this piece. Instead of reading it, you can all go away and read it later. And I'm just going to summarize each of these pieces as we go along. So there's a framework foundation, and that is UNDRIP and RIPR. And that is a very positive piece. And then there's 3 basic pillars, taking a whole government approach, focusing on a whole of society approach, and adopting an open and transparent process. And I'm going to talk about each of those separately as we go along. So it's very positive that provincial government is centering First Nations government in this strategy. Co-development so far, I have seen more work, more effort trying to do real co-development work and engage with nations than I've seen before. In reality, in terms of who's holding the pen, those efforts have been relatively limited to date. I think that's a complicated thing to do, and so there needs to be more of that, and there needs to be sufficient capacity funding for nations in order to actually make this a co-developed piece of work. And in general, those 3 pillars, the 1 and 3, have a fair bit of substance to them, and pillar 2 is pretty high level. So it's fairly hard to know how to respond. Get to that. So the framework sets the stage for a desired transformational shift. And it recognizes that that is needed to end up with strong, stable, prosperous communities and economies at the end of the day. And this is, I think, a real effort to move away from the jobs versus environment situation that we have often found ourselves in. It's an acknowledgement of this hierarchy, and that is positive. We have rarely seen that kind of messaging. We often find that these values get pitted against each other, which ends up in usually both communities, nations, and ecosystems doing badly. So it's good to see this. They have a section on creating conditions for change, and this is basically just realistic about the challenge. It's good to see that, because if we thought this was easy, then they weren't planning to do it. It can't be easy. So realism is good. Again, we need to figure out how Ministry of Forests, Ministry of Mines, and Emily are going to be brought into alignment and held accountable within this framework. Those different ministries have a different mandate, and there's always been an ongoing gunfight between the different ministries in the province. We know that, we witness it, we see it. The balance of power has been elsewhere historically, and this suggests there's going to be a change in that. There have to be clear lines of authority to override the existing decision making in order for this to be effective peace. And there are going to be slow adopters, both perhaps in the sense of individual people in the different ministries. There are obviously people in all ministries who are on board with this work, and there's obviously people who are not. There may be entire ministries who are hard to get on board, and there may be individual people who are hard to get on board. And that will be a challenge for the provincial government to really tackle that issue. So this is a policy geek out. So this is your relief for the moment. Just read the cartoon and enjoy it, because in case anybody thinks I've gone completely mad, I haven't lost the fact that there is always ways out of this thing, and there's always people who are not trying to do the right thing. And so, just don't be fooled by the idea that I'm being all positive. we need optimism tinged with a little reality check of the scope of how much we have to change in order to have this be reality. Okay, hopefully you're done reading one of my favorite comics off the web. So pillar 1, taking a whole of government approach. What does that mean? These words actually come out of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the work that has stemmed out of them. These are similar words that the federal government uses. So how do we make this stuff real? What does whole of government mean? This work started out focusing on forest policy and old growth, and now the province has said we're going to take a whole of government approach. So what does that mean? That means that we have to consider the whole kit and caboodle: pellets, resorts, oil and gas, LNG. Like, how does all of that fit within this framework? How is it going to be measured? At what scale is it going to be measured? You know, I think when this work started, we were talking about stands of trees, but actually we need to consider the biggest threat to biodiversity and communities in British Columbia is climate change. So if we do not consider, for instance, carbon and the trajectory of carbon in our forests, forests are the largest emitter of greenhouse gas in British Columbia, and they're harvesting, even without considering wildfires, forest harvesting gives out more greenhouse gas than anything else. We don't consider that at all. In fact, we still play gaming with that kind of information. And so, you know, whole of government means doing a good job of this bigger picture. And of course, there are different strategies that are in play in British Columbia right now that potentially head in the opposite direction. So how will these things come together? I'll come back to that in a minute. So this pillar 1, this is some of the detail. I'm just going to go through the detail of what it says. Again, don't read it here, read it at home afterwards. They say they're going to establish an Office of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health and put in place potentially a chief ecologist with some power. They're going to focus on data. They're going to set objectives and standards, and they're going to champion and become accountable for these pieces being laid out. On the second page of that, they're going to develop a new law co-developed with First Nations. Going to align across all the programs that deal with land and other pieces of management. And they're going to set this direction and give it to the ongoing planning work that's ongoing. And they're going to use ecosystem-based management, cumulative effects management, restoration. They're going to center parks and protected areas, and they're going to look to end up with resilient communities. All of these things, this is quite a substantive pillar. I think there's a need to applaud the general approach. The idea of having a biodiversity and ecosystem health office is a very positive one. Hopefully that can be put in place in the short term. It needs to be ready for action going forward. This office needs to be overarching and have the actual power to do its job. And so it has to be structured in such a way that all major decisions and policy direction actually funnel through this office. If major decisions are still made individually within ministries, then its ability to be effective will be very limited. And, you know, in the short term, what we have is a whole bunch of decision makers out there who are not following this notion. And so I think as an immediate action, there needs to be a strong signal to existing statutory decision makers that the leaning of how decisions are made need to change to reflect this, this commitment. So just more on this piece, the new law that is being proposed, that's very positive. It needs to be cross-sector and it needs teeth. There need to be new tools under that law in order to be effective, and it has to include ecosystems, something that we don't currently have in BC. There has to be appropriate oversight and accountability of the decision makers below that feeds into this. And so again, I repeat, it needs this overarching status. The standards that will be developed have to embrace both science and Indigenous knowledge. And, you know, the crux of the thing will come down to this last bullet, really. Ecosystem health it has to be defined really using really rigorous approach, and it needs to be determining this piece will be really critical going forward. It's an interesting thing because the province has its cumulative effects program that has done relatively little out in the real world, but they have developed a whole bunch of standards. So, for instance, they have developed a biodiversity protocol. I have worked on it, probably over the last 15 years. It's been in development. It exists today. It's signed off, that protocol, but it's actually not used for anything. It doesn't exist on the website, as they have run, in fact, the biodiversity protocol for the whole province. It shows that the biodiversity of the province is at risk, and it would provide a really good starting place as a standard to understand the direction that we need to go in. There's also an aquatic biodiversity protocol that can be used in a similar way, and that work needs to quickly come to the fore in order to be to inform this work. Again, all right, let's have another little moment of break. Of course, there are many examples where you get into these situations where the truth is basically shouted down by somebody repeating something that doesn't make any sense. And yet these things continue to drive our policy. We talk about sequestration rates of little trees when we are harvesting trees that have the most carbon of practically any trees in the world, and also have the most stable long-term storage potential in the wetter ecosystems of the province. And yet we don't consider those in a real way. So if this thing is going to be real, this office needs to deal with some of these myths and tackle them straightforwardly, and actually put some real sense into some of this decision making. Pillar 2 talks about supporting a broader whole of society approach. And then there's not a whole bunch underneath that. So it sounds great. There's not a lot of substance to commenting on. I think it's important that we don't get lost in this, although it is an important piece, because we actually have to collectively as a society support this work, and that's an important thing. So one of the things that I think is possibly a useful thing is to fund an education program in the broader sense. I suspect that most people who are on this call didn't actually need a paradigm shift, but there's people who do. And so George Monbiot wrote a piece that said "Vive la France," which I'm from the north of England, so I would never repeat that normally, but here I will repeat his article. He basically said, France has a ministry for ecological transition, and France basically put a whole bunch of money into educating the people in the provincial government, in their government, about the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis, in order for people to be more on page. And this kind of work, although, I think it's probably really necessary that we do this work, because we've watched the conversation change, I think, collectively out there, but there's still big time naysayers, and some of them will never change their minds, but there's a lot of people in the middle who don't really have a good sense of why this is important, and there's probably some work to be done around that. Pillar 3 talks about adopting an open and transparent process. And, I think in a way, this is going to require more change than almost anything else. Things do not operate like that today. For instance, things like this media release that sends some of us through the roof in terms of blood pressure. There is a strong desire to say that we're doing well when we're not doing well, and we haven't changed anything. This particular media release is just an example, just ignore it. But, when the province first released the Part 13 deferrals, half of them at least were not even areas that were at risk. And so there is a strong desire still to claim that we have moved forward when we haven't. Throughout the old growth deferrals, there's been a very uneven handling of data. There's no new mapping. Areas have been taken off the map. Nobody knows where. We had to take areas off the map if old growth was not found in that place, but they didn't allow areas to be added to the maps when they were in fact found. And so this lack of overall transparency is a real problem, and it's a real trust issue. And I think government needs to take this really seriously if they're going to do this work. So this Pillar 3 section has an implementation plan outlined, and they're going to identify some interim measures. So understanding that they have committed to new legislation, that new legislation will not come onto the books until the next mandate. So the NDP have to win the next election and have the ability to do this work going forward. So in the interim, we need some potential interim measures, and it talks about that here. They want to develop an oversight system, and they want to report out on how well they're doing. So implementation plan, we're all sick of these reports. Let's get on with it, but that's what's coming. So fine, but let's get on with the work. In terms of oversight, it's fairly weak and minimal, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out. So that needs to be strengthened. And reporting is good and needed, but let's not get lost in that either. One of the most robust sections in this Pillar 3 is the need for interim measures. And, you know, we need clear and transparent implementation of those interim measures. So in my mind, there's two kind of buckets of things that need to be dealt with in the short term. One is we have this legacy of impacts that come from the previous regime. You know, I said at the beginning that we've got rid of those timber supply caps. That is great, but of course, none of the targets that were set as a result of them have changed. So, you know, in particular, there is egregious targets like the 1/3 drawdown, which meant that for you were supposed to meet, if you had a 9% old forest target, then you could meet 2/3 of that target in 250 years from now. That's a ludicrous notion. So 45% of the province have this drawdown of targets applied to it. And that is something that should be struck down. In many parts of the province, I'm standing in the Kootenays, where something like 20% of the old growth management areas are actually all made up of old growth, and yet there's old growth outside those old growth management areas. Now, that needs to be fixed to prevent loss of that in the short term. That is a broader provincial issue with variation around the province in terms of how bad it is. I suggest that all the remaining big treed old growth, big and big treed old growth as defined by the technical advisory panel should be off limits, because the amount left is extremely tiny compared to what naturally would have been there. And those ecosystems are at extreme high risk today. So that's the legacy impacts piece. In terms of ongoing threats, I suggest that we implement, I've suggested this for a long time, but that we implement a chain of custody for waste, because we're in this bizarre situation that we are developing these bioenergy and bioproduct pieces that potentially could be very positive, but only if they are actually using waste. If they increase the pressure on the forest, then this is not going to be a good solution. Wood waste, the issue of pellets is a whole other talk. I will not dive off into that. But, you know, if a sawmill creates waste, if you use that to make pellets and you heat your local school, whoa, 2 tons of snow just fell off my roof. Sorry, that was a bit if you use that to heat your local school, then that can be carbon neutral. But making pellets out of deciduous trees and shipping them to Europe, that is not carbon neutral. So we need to get a handle on that piece. That's the kind of thing that will feed into a place where you've got strategies that are at odds with each other. In terms of big ongoing threats, we should not be making big decisions about things in the short term until this thing is in place. So, for instance, resort developments that are slated for places that have rare species, caribou that are practically gone, and grizzly bears in the south of the interior, you know, those things should be put on hold until we have a strategy that we're actually evaluating impacts. And frankly, I think, you know, you should think about the thing that worries you most and put it in here. Suggest to the government that they come up with interim strategy to deal with it. So I'm almost at the end. In terms of overall comments on the framework, just wrapping this up, in the big picture, I welcome and applaud the work. There's good people working on this, trying to do very positive things, and I think that the whole framing of the work is really very positive. This new legislation is absolutely critical, and I think one of the hardest pieces is for government to take charge within government and to lay out a structure, and the authorities, they have to be overarching so that this can, it must be truly co-developed with nations. Otherwise, it won't be effective. New tools are going to be needed, and this is really an opportunity for global leadership on some of these pieces where the world is struggling with a lot of these same issues, and at the same time, we have to recognize that the threats out there are actually changing, and there needs to be action on day one. Otherwise, people will have a hard time continuing to support it. Succinctly, I think those are the big three. This thing must have teeth. It has to be overarching, and we need to, the staff need to be got on board, or choose your word. I think there's another piece to this. We cannot ignore the enabling measures. So they are asking for comments on the framework, but there's a bit of a tendency to be a bit focused on the framework, and needs to be, the other pieces have to come into play. Otherwise, this will be really hard to get over the line in a meaningful way. The issue of the fact that we still send wood overseas, we have, this little piece here. If you ship your wood more than 3,000 miles, it's exempt from taxes that were intended to drive volume to stay in British Columbia. These things were put in place in the last government. They have not been changed. If we're serious, we need to actually deal with some of these things that were developed specifically for individual companies. That's really clear about how these things happened in the past. So we need to deal with actual keeping wood in British Columbia. And not only that, but we need to focus that on the value added industry. And, I believe there was a move to take pellets off the list of value added. It was on there. I don't know if it's actually changed, but we need to get real about this and actually develop and deliver volume to places like Kalesnikov, who are actually getting 5 or 10 times the number of jobs per tree cut. And that's the way out of this. We know without this framework that the timber supply of the province is declining anyway. With these changes, it will decline further, and we have done a really poor job of developing the community part of the forest industry, and that is one of the key things that we need to enable this going forward. The province is not at this moment looking at revising the timber supply review process, which desperately needs an overhaul, and the appraisal system, which also needs an overhaul in terms of moving these pieces forward. I think they, although I appreciate the kind of overwhelming nature of changing everything all the same time, it's actually really important that some of these key processes are open and changed. So they also need to be dealt with. And, we need to get away from this. This is the rhetoric. I personally feel like I'm watching the rhetoric change. I've seen less of this coming forward, but I would bet we'll get more of this coming forward as this strategy goes forward. I encourage people to let their MLAs know that this matters to them, and to send specific comments back into the ministry. That is me done, and I will stop sharing and answer questions. Thanks.